So just quickly, I think that it's worth mentioning that homeless and the view of homeless nationally has changed dramatically over the last 40 years or so. So anyone who's ever been involved in homelessness, homeless services, has always been trying to end homelessness. This is not anything new. Homelessness essentially did not exist in our landscape prior to 1980. This was a fringe social problem, a real one for those suffering with it, but in terms of how we talk about it today, it just didn't exist. If you do searches on newspaper articles on homelessness pre-1980, you cannot find them. The word homelessness isn't really part of our lexicon until the 80s. Okay, certain social changes occurred, and all of a sudden we have people who can't earn a home. And what we did is we reacted to homelessness the same way that we've historically reacted to homelessness throughout our history, when it was just a sort of force majeure, temporary act of God type of event. We opened shelters, and it was a pretty simple idea. So if you have a person who's suffering from homelessness, they may exist in a continuum of need, right? There's folks who are very low need, and there are folks who are high need. But our services weren't particularly oriented towards this. So our efforts to get a home for anyone who were experiencing homelessness started at sheltering. And the notion was twofold. One, we can prevent them from dying on the streets. And two, really when they get a stable place like a shelter bed, then they'll be able to exit homelessness. So regardless of where they were in this continuum, it would lead to a house and homelessness is solved. After a certain amount of time, we started to realize that this really wasn't happening, that this dynamic really wasn't existing for folks that were in sort of a lower need, who didn't have to change dramatically in order to gain the resources to earn a home, worked okay. In fact, that really covers a great majority, statistically, of the people who experience homelessness. It's usually very short-lived. People need a short amount of help, and they can exit on their own, they can access resources, they can call family, they can gather whatever resources they need to become housed again. But what we learned is that this part of the population was languishing. So there was a change. There was this idea that we could use programming within shelters to stabilize people. We could provide case management, and we could impose certain ideas about things that cause their homelessness. You have to get treatment, you have to go to job training, you have to be sober, all sorts of requirements. And the notion was that we could inspire people to change, and when they change, they become low need, and then they can earn a home. Well, maybe this line that the system worked a little bit, worked well originally, maybe we were able to move this a little bit this way, right? But it didn't work that well because people don't change very much. I don't change very much. You don't change very much. Change is really, really hard. I think about ways I can change all the time, and I don't. So taking the people who need to change the very most, the most unlucky of all of us, put them in an unstable situation like homelessness, in a collective setting like a homeless shelter, which is chaotic and dealing with all sorts of different issues, all sorts of exposure to even pathogens, and, mental illness and addiction issues, all in this one place. And this is where you're going to change and become low need. This was not a great plan. Very well intended, but what we learned is that didn't work very well. And the folks with the higher needs were languishing still. And while they're languishing, that's just code speak for spending a lot of time in the jail, a lot of time on the streets, a lot of time in the ER, a lot of time in shelters, a lot of time in the courts. They were costing the community, if they were homeless at least a year, the statistics show they were costing the community over $50,000 in services a year. And they were dying at an average age of 55 years. So what did we do? The next change was a group of folks in New York City decided why don't we just put them in a house? Why don't we consider housing a right? Let's not predetermine that they can't be housed. Maybe the home is the stability they need to address their mental health issues, to address their substance abuse issues, to address their other challenges, their other culmination of bad luck that brought them to this state to begin with. So we did this carve out. And for the folks who are chronically homeless, we developed this thing called Housing First. And you've heard about it on the news, and Salt Lake City has gotten a lot of press about this, and you heard it referenced in the letter I read to you. This is a notion that without conditions, you give someone a house. And then you start to work with them, because the house is stable. Okay? What happens? It costs a lot of money. They have a supportive case manager and rental assistance. But guess what? It's about 40% the cost of having them on the street. So the idea is you don't expect people to change in a shelter. Let's treat housing as a right for them. Let's treat housing as a better response to homelessness from an effectiveness and cost effectiveness point of view. Let's get them right into a house. Then something else happened. It's like, why aren't we treating everybody in a housing first way? Why are we just limited to these folks? Because there's a whole other subset of needy folks who are still languishing, who we don't have good answers to. And while we're trying to treat them in shelter still and having all these compliance type of programming for them, sure, it works for some, but most often they just end up here anyway. So let's get them into housing fast before things get worse. Because if you think about a homeless shelter, it shouldn't surprise you that it actually can make their conditions worse. It's not a healthy place to be. It creates a lot of anxiety. So is substance abuse going to get better naturally? Sorry, Susan. Is substance abuse going to get better in a shelter? Probably not. Is their health going to get better in a shelter? Probably not. Is their mental health issues going to get better in a shelter? Probably not. So we start to take the housing first notion and we apply it to the entire spectrum of folks. Sometimes it's just a few days in a shelter. They don't need any help at all. Okay? Sometimes it's help getting a job and they need a month in a shelter. And we're going to do some first and last month rent and they're in a house. Sometimes we do a temporary assistance program called rapid rehousing. This is short-term to a year's type of assistance. They get a case manager, and in the stability of the home, we can maximize their income. Okay? We can start getting people into treatment because they're not struggling on a day-to-day basis. And then we can exit them for these medium needs people. In this middle zone, there are some people who are disabled, they can't work, they're gonna need rental assistance. That's all they need. They don't need a case manager per se. They don't need me going every week. Maybe I check in once every couple of months. Or maybe the landlord has my number so they can call me if things are going haywire. So here's your Section 8, or what we call HCV. Here's rapid rehousing. And sure, over here, what we now call permanent supportive housing, which has replaced housing first, for the most needy. And this ends up looking at what the dynamic is. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, but just a few numbers if we could. On your scale there, what percentages do you think fit into, well, you got like 5 categories there. What percentages fit into those?
God.
And do you see them growing or shrinking? Or?
It's really, really hard to say. I mean, homeless data is famously inaccurate.
But you know how many.
We do the best we can. So with that said, you know, there's a researcher in the University of Pennsylvania named Dennis Mulvane, who estimates that 70%, 75% of the folks who experience homelessness experience it very short term. And if they enter systems, they enter for less than 30 days, and they need very little support other than this very interim. In other words, their bad luck has not manifested itself in such a great amount of barriers to them getting their needs met that they can just use the temporary support. So these are the folks, you know, for lack of a better expression, that you don't notice, right? These aren't making the sort of impacts. They're not absorbing a lot of community resources. Their bad luck doesn't manifest itself into a huge expense for the community. It doesn't manifest itself necessarily in it's pretty bad outcomes for people who live in poverty in terms of their life expectancy too, but it doesn't reach this sort of level that affects really long-term homelessness. So there's your basis right there. So it's up to about 3/4 of folks really need very little assistance at all, right? We also know statistically, I think the stat is something like 20% of the population takes up 80% of the resources. So chronic homelessness nationally is in this sort of, I think 12 to 15% range. That's for anyone who is basically defined to have been homeless for longer than a year. Okay, so they are recognized as the folks, one, whose impact homelessness has on them is the greatest. They're going to have the greatest effect. They're going to be in jail the most. They're going to impact the community the most too. And so that's about, again, 12, 15% of the population. And so that's leaving, on any given night, an additional 12, 15% or so in this middle zone is going to need some other sort of assistance. We have a system that at some point when people's bad luck is bad enough, they become homeless. Because the system is not there to provide these supports. I mean, that's what we're here doing, right? Boulder County has decided to change how we provide system support. Rather than depend on the individual to change to meet the needs of the system, to earn your home, it's a recognition that the system has to adjust, right? But as a nation, the system exists in a way that is always going to create homelessness. And this has been true due to various things, especially starting in the 70s and 80s. One of the things that I vocalize quite, strongly is that these systems are so complicated that people with the highest needs can't even access them. If you don't have a mailing address or a phone, how are you going to get a housing choice voucher? How are you going to know when the orientation is? How are you going to, you've got all sorts of life-threatening competition in your life. And so just carving out the time to, what ends up happening is you end up skimming from the top, right? And so only the most functional folks of the needy group end up really accessing these resources. So one of the things you have to deal with when you're working in a homeless shelter is to understand you're not going to save everybody. And there's a lot to unravel in what you said.
Why would you want to save everybody? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Why would I? Well, I mean,
Yeah,
again, there's a lot to unravel. I mean, I think I could, if I would like in a perfect world to be able to save everybody, I think that that's not an unreasonable thing to believe. Just if you don't think it's possible, just because of the pragmatism of it, I'm a pretty pragmatic guy. So I understand. What I'm trying to say is I understand sort of what you're saying. When we come to the work at a homeless shelter, we're not under the illusion that we can fix every problem that we see. We're not under the illusion that it's only the system's fault. We're not under the illusion, there's a confluence of events that are going on here that provide a person who's standing in front of me to be unbelievably needy. But ultimately, if we're talking about it from a very pragmatic point of view, which I think is part of what you're saying, I can save the taxpayer money by taking a chronically homeless person off the street rather than letting him languish on the streets. It's just the data's just there to show it. And so we don't even have to talk about the goal of trying to provide a minimum something for everyone. We don't have to talk about a goal of compassion or what even those words even mean. We can just simply say, let's save some money, and so that the varied cost of homelessness in the fire department, so the varied cost of the homelessness at the police department, so the varied cost of homelessness in the ER, so the varied cost of homelessness in the jail. These are all things we're paying for anyway. So why don't we pay for it in a way that gets the best outcomes for that person? And so that's the approach. And in terms of addressing people who have a lower need set or are not quite as unfortunate as the folks that we've been regularly dealing with, let's prevent them from being in a system that makes them sicker and makes their mental health issues worse and makes their substance abuse worse, like getting them help when they need it. So again, the burden on the taxpayer is minimized.